Hello and welcome to episode 69 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm Dalton.
Welcome back, chaps. Chris, your friend sent you a text the other day with a very interesting question. And that question was, is Linux hard to use?
Yep. He sent it to me completely out of the blue. I mean, not out of the blue. He knows what I do for a living, and we've talked about it before, usually when he's complaining about Windows. And I say, you could run something else. So I answered immediately, absolutely not, and very much yes.
Yep, exactly.
So I went on to explain a little bit. At work, it can be a complete mess, but it is also possible to install a fairly robust, well-maintained distro and run it as your desktop operating system. As long as you understand, you won't get proper Microsoft Office, and if you want to run some games, there'll be anti-cheat and stuff. And I asked him why, and he said, I want to be a hipster. To which I replied, you need to realize that the Linux definition of hipster is very different to the mainstream definition.
Yeah, that's funny. If you run just Ubuntu, you're probably hipster by normal computer person standards, whereas by Linux user standards, that's like really square if you don't use like Arch or NixOS or whatever.
Exactly.
I think that it isn't necessarily for most people harder to use than Windows. I think it's just easier to get help with Windows when you need it for a lot of people. You know, my parents both run Linux on their primary computers. My dad does all sorts of 3D printing stuff, so he's got a slicer on there, and he knows how to do file management and everything. And I think that teaching him how to do that on Linux was about just as hard as teaching him to do it on Windows, for all intents and purposes. At least on Linux, when you plug in a USB drive, at least in Ubuntu Mate, it shows up on the desktop. That makes things easier.
Well, I just swapped my mum's computer out for one running Ubuntu without telling her. And she just went, oh, my taskbar's moved to the side. And that was basically our only observation. So it can't be that hard, right?
I found that introducing people to functionality, not equivalence, is quite useful as well. So try and say, oh, if you want to write a document, you open this program. If you want to look at the internet, I mean, the browsers are fairly standardized. But do you see what I mean? Most people approach a computer for the things that it can allow them to do, not the way that it does them. So if you say, oh, this is how you achieve this task, very quickly, as you say, Gary, oh, the taskbar's moved, or oh, I click this icon, and it becomes muscle memory. And frequently you'll be like, what application are you running? Oh, LibreOffice. So I do think, we had George on recently. Desktop is in a fairly solid place to onboard someone who is using a computer for your bog standard productivity and internet browsing based workflow, I think. But when I see people in my job, for example, when people are trying to run machine learning on a graphics card and get their CUDA versions straight, there is no DDU utility in safe mode in this format. And they're trying to match shared libraries that don't have consistent naming schemes for someone who thinks purely numerically. That's when it starts to become trickier. I'm not experienced enough with Windows anymore. Do I just have tunnel vision? And are there equivalent workloads on Windows as an operating system that get as much in the weeds as that?
I don't think it is a hot take to say that software development on Linux is still hard. I think that's a pretty cold take at this point.
Well, you think about the challenge we did to run the oldest Ubuntu we could, and what happened there. I was trying to run an old browser with new TLS patches, and I couldn't compile it from source because glibc, GCC, the core utils of Linux, GNU/Linux, I should say more appropriately, had shifted too much. But I could just download a binary and a bunch of DLLs and run it in Wine on an operating system from 2006. But you say that, Dalton, and WSL, it might be technically tricky to achieve things, but TensorFlow, as I've said before, when you go to Windows installation instructions, it says, here is a link to WSL. WSL is incredibly popular, and loads of people are doing their development on it. So despite its kind of difficulties, what you can achieve with it remains quite sought after.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. Linux lets you do things far more powerfully than you can do on Windows. It's easier to get into the kernel stuff, and if you hit a bug, you can actually look at the kernel and see why you're hitting the bug. So I think that makes software development easier. But the tooling on Windows, if you're taking the happy path on Windows and you're taking the happy path on Linux, you're having a much harder time on Linux than you are on Windows. Visual Studio is quite good, I'd say, and the tooling around it is also similarly quite good. And I don't think there's significant problems there. But if you mess something up, you're going to be there for weeks, which I guess is the same in either case.
But if you're not a developer, if you're just a normal user, then desktop Linux, let's just say Ubuntu, because that's the most popular, right? It is broadly very easy to use, but then things do occasionally go wrong. And like you said, it's probably easier to find support for Windows, but stuff does go wrong on Windows quite a lot. Like, I was trying to install Windows on a machine, I think the one that I gave to my niece, and one of the updates just wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. And I had to do all sorts of bullshit to make it work. And it was something to do with not enough space or something. And that was just completely stock Windows 10. And that was no easier to fix than a problem with an Ubuntu system.
Yeah, but I think you're assuming that normal people actually care about that. No normal user opens settings, goes to updates, sees an update failing to install, and then goes down a path of, how do I fix this now?
Yeah.
I just leave it. It's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Well, frequently when I was running a little residential support business, the thing that would happen to Windows machines is the dreaded srttrail.txt error, which if you can't get decent event viewer logs on Windows, it's just as you say, Joe, it's incredibly frustrating. And I've actually physically pressed the escape key or Control-Alt function key to try and get a TTY out of muscle memory in those situations. And I'm like, it's not there. What? Of course, I can't have that here. And frequently, the solution would just be to back up the user's files and just reinstall the goddamn operating system, because looking through registry files and everything is just opaque. Now, that's me. I'm trying to get into the weeds. A Linux machine can get quite balked and still be repairable because you can live boot a USB. There's all sorts of ways you can get in, manipulate things, and get things going again without having to resort to a reinstall if you know what you're doing. And I found that's not so much of an option on Windows. But I do agree with what you said, Gary. I was running a residential support business, so the person was going, broken computer, fix it, please, sir. I will give you some money. Most people aren't, they're going to look to someone else, or often I'd get given 5 or 6 laptops for the stack because they were like, oh, I couldn't get this one working, so I went to Curry's and bought another one.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that before.
And the bottom line is that that's kind of the way most people work, but it's also the way most repair shops work. You can almost guarantee that most of the mom and pop computer repair shops are just going to throw a new Windows image on the machine and not worry about recovering whatever's there.
I mean, I'd do the same thing with Linux.
Yeah, I also do the same thing with Linux. I don't have the time or the patience anymore to troubleshoot things. I'm just going to boot from a new live USB and reinstall, and I can be up and running in 20 minutes.
Well, I had to do quite a lot of that recently because I've got a laptop that I want to install Ubuntu 24.04 on, and it's just not having it. Every time I try and upgrade or do a fresh install, just something goes wrong with it. It's my fault for getting a laptop that's too new, but it is very easy to just back up your home directory, reinstall, restore, good to go.
Sure, but you know what would be even easier? Just using the Dell supplied Windows image.
Yeah.
That's really easy.
I don't know if it is, though, because backing up all of your stuff and settings on Windows is not nearly as easy as doing it on Linux. Even if you know what you're doing, I mean, I just reinstalled Windows on my desktop over the weekend because it's fun sometimes. I mean, we've talked about that before, right? And getting back to where I was is actually really difficult because things spew stuff all over app data and local app data and roaming. And
Yeah.
there's stuff in program data and there's stuff in the registry. And you're just starting from scratch every time and clicking all the buttons again to make it work. Kind of like using KDE, actually. Whoa!
Phelim's got his stick out again. Careful, Dalton, he's coming for you. Also, the recovery images tend to be warehouse old, so not even laptop old. And I would never use them. I would often preserve the recovery partition and say to the person, look, you can press this function key that comes up when you first boot, and you can do a disk-to-disk copy from an image and go back to box fresh, but please don't do that because you'll be several major releases of this version of Windows behind, and you're just creating a load of upgrades pain that you're going to have to go through.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. When you go through airport security, there's one line where the TSA agent checks your ID and another where a machine scans your bag. The same thing happens in enterprise security, but instead of passengers and luggage, it's end users and their devices. These days, most companies are pretty good at the first part of the equation, where they check user identity, but user devices can roll right through authentication without getting inspected at all. In fact, a huge percentage of companies allow unmanaged, untrusted devices to access their data. That means an employee can log in from a laptop that has its firewall turned off and hasn't been updated in 6 months. Or worse, that laptop might belong to a bad actor using employee credentials. Kolide finally solves the device trust problem. Kolide ensures that no device can log into your Okta-protected apps unless it passes your security checks. Plus, you can use Kolide on devices without MDM, like your Linux fleet, contractor devices, and every BYOD phone and laptop in your company. So support the show and go to kolide.com/LinuxAfterDark to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/LinuxAfterDark. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxafterdark.net/support. And for either $5 or $10 a month on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxafterdark.net. What about using a Mac or Chrome OS? Because it seems quite clear that in the Windows and Linux world, it is just pretty hard to use a computer. And you have to kind of know what you're doing. But with Chrome OS, with a Chromebook, I don't think you need to know what you're doing, do you? That's really easy. There's not really anything to go wrong with it.
No, I mean, it's pretty easy. You just turn it on and sign in with your Google account. And if it messes up, you hold down the power button and it reinstalls the OS and you sign back in with your Google account and everything's just how you left it for the most part.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's pretty easy. On a Mac, not so sure. It's probably somewhere in between, isn't it, to have to reinstall the OS on a Mac? I mean, I know you just hold the power button and like it should just work, but it's not quite the experience of sign back into your Apple ID and there everything is.
I also think that, in my experience, macOS tends to place obstructions in the way of users for sound security reasons that actually very much frustrate users, like sharing your screen. Now, it has saved people. There was one poor unfortunate lady who called me and said, I think I've been hacked. And luckily she hadn't been, because they were trying to get a screen sharing session. But that had been a Windows machine. She'd opened TeamViewer, but they would have got straight in. Because it's Apple with the advanced granular security settings, in the panic, she couldn't remember her own account password for the machine. So apparently the guy on the other end was saying, yeah, and then click the padlock and put your password in. It's saying my password is wrong. Right, keep going. And in the end, they fell back to an old-fashioned con scam purely on the telephone because they realized they couldn't get into her machine and tried to get her to physically go to a bank and get money out. But that's what I've found, is that people are trying to do things and Apple won't let them. And yes, there are sound reasons for that, but it makes their computing experience. It's the old security versus convenience graph. And they tip it too far sometimes, I think.
So do we think that what George is doing with these composable desktop Linux distros, does that make it easier to use or more difficult or the same?
I think it's probably very much the same, to be honest, from an end user point of view. My mum's got unattended upgrades turned on Ubuntu. Is it more likely to break than one of the composable OSs? Probably. But equally, she's been running 2204 for 2 years now and it hasn't broken yet. So there's quite a lot that I would have to do as someone building that operating system image to build it. And am I just going to abandon that image or that build process until next time? She needs to reinstall and then have to remind myself how to rebuild the fresh new ISO for Bluefin Gary's Mum edition, probably. So I don't really know what it adds unless it's something that I'm doing and using all the time, is the slight difficulty I've got there.
But you don't think it would change her day-to-day user experience because she would just open the browser, open LibreOffice, and it would just be the same?
Yeah, I mean, she turns on the computer and she opens Chrome and she clicks the Gmail bookmark or clicks the Google Docs bookmark or prints an invoice or saves something. That's her experience of the computer. And it doesn't matter if it's a Windows machine or an Ubuntu machine or it was running Bluefin, or if I gave her a Chromebook. She boots the computer, she opens a browser, she does her thing, she turns the computer off.
I think in terms of keeping the computer up to date, because obviously we've all talked about you go around and you have to update all of their computers because they haven't done it since you were last there. There's still merit there. Having the computer just automatically up to date the next time they reboot it, I think there's a lot of value to that, just not necessarily user visible value.
Yeah, it's more for the admin in this case, that is you.
Right. And I mean, on distribution upgrades, Fedora 38 to 39, 39 to 40, I think there's a lot of merit there because it is very scary for someone to actually do that in Ubuntu, I think, if they don't know what's going on. And they'll probably just avoid clicking the button. But if it's just done, then who's any the wiser?
Yeah, that's true, because I installed Bluefin on the machine I keep on my desk and then rebooted, and it was suddenly Fedora 39 one day. And that was great because I didn't notice any difference, apart from my wallpaper changed for some reason. But yeah, whatever. Whereas, yeah, I have yet to tackle upgrading my mum's machine to 2404. I would imagine that's going to be a little bit more painful than just reboot and it's 2404 one day.
Yeah, definitely don't do that yet. Wait for the point release when they officially support it. Don't be doing a do release upgrade -D because it's just painful.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to be doing that until 2410 comes out, frankly.
I think George's system is the same answer I gave at the beginning as well, isn't it? Is Bluefin hard to use? No. And yes, if you want to do your own composable image that has a GitHub action, I think the versatility is what stands out. And I would echo what you said, Gary and Dalton. I think I would be less scared of a power cut in the middle of a Bluefin version to version upgrade than I would of Ubuntu, because I wouldn't want to pick up a machine that shut down halfway through do release upgrade and try and unpick what's happened. Whereas I'm be fairly confident a pinned deployment would be available from Grub. I go into that and just run RPM OS tree again. So there are some strengths to it, but it boils down to the same thing. Computers are incredibly easy and immensely frustrating.
That's actually a really good point, because the number one problem that I had when I was supporting large numbers of Linux machines was the computer would turn off unexpectedly and it wouldn't boot again because FSCK wouldn't allow it to boot again.
The original question was, is Linux hard to use? And what's funny to me is that we've all gone down this path of what it's like to be an administrator effectively. But I think you've got to put yourself in the shoes of a user. And yeah, for someone like your mum, Gary, who uses just a couple of applications, that's fine. But what about someone who wants to install the stuff that they're used to? You know, they hear about this new thing and they want to install it. If it's not available for Linux, then that makes Linux hard to use.
Witness the file manager of the average user in that situation and the reams of program.exe, program brackets 1.exe, program brackets 2.exe, program brackets 3. You see? So yes, there is often applications that just don't offer that option. And most people, in their head, it is a computer, not an operating system. So they just think this will run. Why isn't it running? I must have done something wrong. Let's try the same thing again.
From my perspective, I actually tried that over the weekend. I wanted to reinstall my computer and I installed Bluefin on it. Of course I did. And I was really enjoying using it. I have to say, I really enjoy using it, but I tried to get a game running and stream it to Discord, which is a thing that I do very often now. Waiting for Joe to insult me.
Yeah, it's fine. Zoomer, whatever.
There we go. And I kind of got it working. There's a custom client for Discord, but you have to know that it exists for one, and you have to know that this is a problem in the first place. And I wanted to play a game that isn't actually on Steam, so it has to be manually installed and stuff through itch. And the itch installer was using X, not Wayland, so the stream was bad, and it was just such a faff. I really, really wanted to get the game running to the point where I tried installing it through Lutris and was trying for several hours to get it installed through Lutris, but it just wouldn't quite work, and ultimately gave up and reinstalled Windows. So I think that for people who just want to use Linux like Windows, that's still not a thing you can do, though for stuff like the Steam Deck, where you don't want to use it exactly like your Windows computer, it's getting a lot closer. Of course, if your workload is available on Linux, then all this is moot anyway, and yeah, it's pretty easy to use.
Well, I guess it's almost the same for me when I wanted to use Linux like Linux, and I installed Ubuntu 22.04 on my ThinkPad Z13, and had all sorts of weird graphical glitches. And I spent about 2 days trying to chase it down, and Chris really helped me with that and came up with a bunch of things that it could be, and we were tracking packages to see when they landed in the LTS of Ubuntu. And ultimately, I just decided I want to use my computer, and I installed Fedora. And that was kind of it. So in that case, Ubuntu was just too hard for me to deal with.
I don't think I agree with that. I think computers are just hard in general for a lot of hardware things, because even helping people set up their computers on Windows after they do a graphics card update, man, sometimes that can be a real slog, especially if they switch from NVIDIA to AMD or something like that. I think it's just always hard.
One thing I would say is, we're talking in general, we're not talking about the machine learning stacks, which I alluded to earlier, but for the average computer user, on Windows, you can do pretty much anything you want to. And you can't quite say that about Linux or maybe even Mac OS. I think that's the difference. It doesn't necessarily run perfectly, but you will be able to do most things that you hear about on Windows. And that's why Microsoft embraces things like WSL. They don't want it to become an operating system where you can't do something without leaving the operating system.
Well, it's even the same with internal tooling and stuff, isn't it? Like at work, we've got a bunch of internal tooling that does stuff that we need to do in our day jobs. And a lot of that tooling is available on Windows. Most of it's available on macOS, and maybe 30% of it's available on Linux. And I find myself using a Windows VM to get the remainder of it working. So it's really tricky. Sometimes there's just stuff that you have to accept that you can't do.
And if you can't do the thing that you want to do, then it's difficult to use the operating system.
Or impossible.
That's why we're at 1%, because you have to be a stubborn bastard. We're not at 1%, are we? We're at 4 or 5 or 6, whichever chart you want to follow this week.
Or maybe 2.
Yeah.
Well, I'm probably in the 0.5% of people in my org that use Linux at work at this point.
But again, if all you want to do is a couple of things that are well supported by Linux, then it is incredibly easy to use. And say you use Ubuntu with unattended upgrades, you're getting the security patches, snaps for all the hate that they get, do self-update. And so it depends is the answer to the original question. It depends what you want to do.
Can we play back what Chris was saying at the beginning?
Exactly. Absolutely not. And absolutely yes.
Right, well, we should probably get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
And I've been Dalton.
See you later.